So thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. David took a class on interviewing methods from me a couple of years ago. And so what we'll do over the next like 70, 80, 90 minutes, however long it takes us to get through it, no, I won't keep you past noon, okay, is talking about and practicing some ways to code interviews, okay? So I want you guys to help me situate myself with respect to you, right? So is everyone here doing some sort of interview study?
Most of us.
Yes.
Okay. So how many of you, raise your hand if you've conducted some interviews already? Okay, awesome. Raise your hand if you've transcribed some of those interviews already. Okay, excellent. So you're all wondering then, well now what? What do I do with this stuff? Okay, so there's lots of ways that you can analyze interviews, one of which is coding. So let's talk about what that is and why we do it, okay? So what is coding, all right? Coding is turning the words that people say to you when you ask them questions into thematic ideas, okay? Into sort of labels for the kinds of ideas that those words are expressing, all right? And so, well, there you go. And it's a way of reducing your data, all right? So especially if you're talking to participants and they're telling you a lot when they answer your questions, you got to figure out a way to make sense of all the stuff that they tell you, okay? So coding is one way to do that, all right? Okay, and so why do we code? So what do we actually get from coding? All right, so one thing is, coding is a way, like I said, it's a way of pulling meaning out of the words that participants tell you, right? And in particular, it's a way of doing that in relation to the research questions that you're asking, right? So we're trying to make sense. So we interviewed people to try to hear about certain kinds of things. And because we have, besides our interview questions, we have some overarching research question that the interviews are supposed to help us answer, right? So codes are a way of sort of trying to identify the ideas that you hear in ways that help you make sense of your research question. And the thing about codes that I like in particular is they help us look for patterns, all right, in our data. One kind of pattern we might find is across participants. So if I interview 10 people about something, how many of them say the same things, right? How many of them say different things? It's just a way of sort of looking for patterns across the participants. And it's also a way of looking for patterns between parts of our interviews, right? So if I ask you about one topic in the beginning part of the interview and I ask you about a different topic later on, then I might want to know, how do people's thoughts about part A relate to their thoughts about part B? And so when I code, okay, I end up with things that I can compare a little more easily. All right. So to my mind, there are two approaches to coding. One is known as narrative analysis, and this is a very kind of loose way of identifying themes in your data, okay? It's the idea about, the reason that you try to identify themes is to sort of tell a story about how someone understands something or what their experiences of something are, okay? And the reason I sort of think of it as like a loose way of coding is because we're not typically in narrative analysis really interested in a giant reduction of the words that people give us down to some other word that labels what all that language is about. But generally in narrative analysis, the reason we call it narrative is because we're trying to tell a story in the words of participants, right? So that's a little bit of a different thing that we won't be doing today, okay? What we'll be doing today is the kind of coding that lends itself, you don't have to do this, but it lends itself to quantitative kinds of analyses, all right? And so one thing that you can do once you've coded interviews is you can count up the frequency of the codes, right? So you can say, how often does this idea get expressed in this interview? and so on and so forth. And you can even do things like look for co-occurrence. So let's say that my research question is something about like how does pet ownership relate to people's lifestyle? So do people with various lifestyle attributes tend to have certain kinds of pets or not, right? So I might ask people what they like to do, and then I might ask them what kind of pets they have. So if I sort of code the pets, right, and I code the things that people like to do, then I can make comparisons like, hey, do people who own dogs also like to walk or hike, right? Okay? I mean, it's a pretty trivial example, but this is the kind of thing that you can do with codes, right? Generally, though, if you want to do a lot of fancy statistical stuff, you need to interview more rather than less people. Okay? All right? And the narrative approach is often more appropriate with a smaller sample, right? Okay? Sometimes when we're doing interviews for the first time and we're trying to figure out how to do it, we often don't try to interview a ton of people, right? Anyway, so it's just something to kind of think about. So, all right, so how are we doing so far?
Good.
Okay, so I imagine right now you're still wondering, okay, but yeah, what's a code, right? Okay, so that's a good question to be having. I'm not quite going to answer it, but yet, but we will in just a couple of minutes. All right? So yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So is the dog example of how you said people that have dogs? Thank you. So is the dog example an example of pattern 2, which is between? Because you're showing the correlation between dogs and people walking or hiking?
That's a great question. So this is actually more an example of patterns between different parts of the interview, right? So I've got how do people answer questions about pets versus how do they answer questions about their lifestyle, right? And if I ask those independently of each other, then I can compare, then I can look to see whether there are patterns in the way people respond, right? Okay?
Thank you.
So, yeah. Okay. So, there are, okay, I put these slides together. I meant to change the title of the slide because it's the same as the last slide. But there's two sort of techniques for coding, okay, that people tend to do, and their differences will be pretty obvious. So one thing is you can do what's known as a priori coding. So a priori is a fancy Latin phrase that just means ahead of time, I think. So, or in advance, I think is really what it means. So anyway, the other way we talk about it is top-down coding. So what that means is I start with a coding scheme, okay? Or I develop a set of codes before I start looking at my transcripts, okay? All right? So you do this when you have a good idea before you start your study of the kinds of things that you're looking for, the kinds of ideas that you expect people to talk about, okay? So let me give you an example. My own research work is mostly around how people think about what makes claims, knowledge claims, especially scientific claims, what makes them believable, and what are reasonable ways to decide why you should believe something, okay? So people have been studying this for a really long time, like since the 50s, okay? So we know a lot already about the kinds of things that people say. So if I was going to do an interview study to dig into this for some reason, I know ahead of time that, well, when people talk about justification, they tend to talk about evidence. They tend to talk about authority, right? So I believe the Earth is round because my mom told me. That's an authority reason, as opposed to I believe the Earth is round because I went up in space and saw it. That's evidence, right? Or I saw a picture of it. That's evidence. So there are different categories. And I know those things in advance because I know that that's what other people have found. So the way you, and so we'll get into, if this is a thing that makes sense for the study that you're doing, we'll talk a little bit about how you actually do that, right? And then the other way is what's known by a bunch of different words. The most common one, I think, is open coding. Sometimes people call it emergent coding or grounded coding. And that's when you don't have a good sense when you start of the kinds of things that people are going to say and the kinds of things that might be important for you. So you develop codes from the language of your interview participants. All right? So from the bottom up. And we use this when our study is sort of more exploratory, right? So if you're investigating a topic that hasn't been investigated a lot before, open coding is a more kind of appropriate way to do it. All right? Okay. So what we're going to do for most of our time now is we're going to practice these things. Okay? But before we can really practice, I need David to come back with our practice materials. I've been away from UCLA for a few months, and I don't have a copy code anymore, so I couldn't have copies of the stuff that I needed. So I need David to make copies for me. So why don't I hear from some of you about what you're doing? So somebody tell me about your interview study. Is this okay? Is it okay if I'm on? Is it okay if I have an orange?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
What's your name?
my name is Tyler. So I'm interviewing, basically my demographics is like college students, and I'm trying to find out about their educational experience K through 12 and how that's kind of affected their, like their academic transition and their trajectory.
Okay. And is that something that we know a lot about?
Yeah, I mean, there's research there. There's not research in the exact way that I'm doing it, but
Okay,
there's
yeah.
there's stuff out there.
Okay. And so can you give us an example of one or two of the interview questions that you're asking people?
Sure. One would be like kind of what were your what was your thought process in enrolling the college that you're currently at? Not exactly, that's not verbatim, but that's what I'm trying to get at is why did they choose to enroll where they are now currently enrolled?
Is that the question that you asked them?
Not verbatim, but yes.
Because that's a good question, right? It's really straightforward. Hey, why did you enroll here?
Okay.
That's a really good question to ask, as opposed to something that's more involved, right?
Superfluous or
But yeah, well, just when we get wordy, we get confusing. So it's better to be less wordy when you're asking or interview questions. But okay, so why did you choose to enroll where you're going to college right now? And how many people are you going to interview?
For this CCU Scholars Program, we do 6 at minimum.
Minimum.
Yeah, minimum of 6.
You going to try to get more?
Yeah,
Okay.
probably 10.
What are you thinking?
Probably like 10. I would
Okay.
say.
All right. So with 10 folks, and if this is a domain, right, like sort of the K-12 sort of factors that influence people's college-going decisions, if that's something that we know a lot about, it might make sense for Tyler, okay, to try to develop an a priori coding scheme, right? Because he can look to the literature that he has, and he can say, okay, well, given what we know about this area already, I would expect people to talk about things like money, right? I would expect them to probably talk about things like mentoring or counseling, like did they get good advice about where to go to college? What else might they talk about?
It's kind of like familial in their background, stuff like that. Like
So how much support they got from their family? Okay. So if you know a lot already about this area, creating a coding scheme before you start to code can actually be super, super helpful. It does 2 things, I think. One is it's much more efficient, right? Because you just go in looking for what you're already looking for, okay? It, because it's built on existing literature, it helps your study talk to that literature much more directly, right? Because you're kind of talking in the same terms that people are already talking. And believe it or not, one of the things that it can do for you is it actually highlights things that you hear. It highlights the things that are different than what you expected to hear. Because when you find a bunch of stuff that you can't apply your codes to, well, you got to think of new codes, right? So by looking for certain things, you can actually emphasize when you're not saying those things and you're saying new things, okay? So those are some advantages of the kind of top-down coding, all right? But, yeah.
So I know that interviews are typically considered qualitative, and that coding is a very much a quantitative, I guess, approach to interviews. And I was wondering if this technically qualifies as like mixed methods, or whether it's common or typical for a qualitative study to incorporate coding as a quantitative method.
So the way we distinguish qualitative and quantitative, there's sort of two ways that we do it. One is based on the nature of the data itself, right? So people's words are qualitative, right? Test scores are quantitative, they're numbers. They live as numbers, they are numbers. They're nothing else but numbers, right? That's what a score is. So that's one way of thinking about whether the work you're doing is quantitative or qualitative, right? Now another way that we can think about it is the kinds of techniques we use to make sense of the data, right? And so you can use, so if you can treat codes like numbers in many ways, right? Have you guys done any, have you dipped any toes in statistics at all? Yeah. Okay, all right. So codes are categorical data, right? That's all it is. It's not ordered, right? Because it's like, so in fact, so when you do statistical analyses of codes, what you have to do is, I give a label to something like pet type, right? In my stupid example, okay? And then I've got labels, you know, dogs, cats, fish, birds, other mammals, say whatever, right, for the ferret owner or something. Like whatever, you know, I just come up with some set of labels that fits my data, okay? If I decide then to do statistical analysis, I actually have to assign those things numbers, right? So dogs might become number 1, number 2, right? But the numbers themselves don't mean anything, right? It's just a different way of labeling the thing. Like there's no oneness to the word dog, and if I put dogs 1 and cats 2, that doesn't mean cats are more than dogs. It's just a different, right? So that's what we mean by categorical. The numbers themselves don't have any meaning, right? They're just a way of labeling the stuff. But it helps the math and the stats program do what it needs to do, okay? So, to my mind then, I don't think that coding, even if you do statistics, is quantitative analysis, no matter what you do with it, because you're not dealing with quantities. Yeah?
Yeah, I actually had a question.
Yeah.
What does the format look like in regards to coding in reference to our interviews? Like, is there a particular format we need to follow, or?
No,
what does that look like?
that's what we'll get into.
Okay.
That's a good question. I'm glad that you're asking because it means you guys are ready to go. I'm just killing time here. But let me hear from someone else and tell us a little bit about the study that you're doing. How about someone, we started front that side, how about back this side? Don't be shy. I'm looking at you guys looking away from everybody. Okay, I'm going to hear from someone I haven't heard from yet. Come on, I want to hear from someone new. Okay, perfect, thank you, appreciate it.
Hi, I'm not in the scholars program.
Okay.
But my background is in ed psych, and right now I'm helping a colleague of mine, who's doing research on Black women working in anti-Blackness work. And she's looking for what it means to be a good ancestor. And so she's asking that question in this interview. And what's coming is emergent definitions of what it means to be a good ancestor. Some women have children, some women don't. What does it mean to be a good ancestor when you have no kids, etc.?
And tell me if I'm right about this, but so it sounds like this is this question about what does it mean to be a good ancestor sounds like a question we probably haven't done a lot of research on.
No.
Right?
No.
And so that's a really great example of like why you wouldn't try to think of codes in advance, because you don't know enough as a researcher, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing something that feels really new, not just to you, but to like, because I know it all feels new to you, but where there's not a lot of research, then that's where you want to pay attention to your data, okay? And kind of let it tell you what it's trying to tell you. Okay? Yeah.
That would be open.
That's open coding. What that just means we're open
Yeah.
to what the data actually are. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question.
So what's the difference between the coding and like creating your hypothesis? Like, what is the difference between the two?
That's a great question. The difference is you have to define codes as a way of representing your data so the codes can tell you whether or not your hypotheses are right. Is that?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. So the question is, how are codes different from hypotheses? That was the base question, right? So the answer is codes. So this will come up again later. We treat codes as data, even though they're not really data, right? The words that people give us are data. But what we do is we convert those words into shorter patterns of words, right? Into labels for things, okay? And those codes then, they become the things that we analyze to find out if our hypothesis about something is correct, right? So maybe my hypothesis, if I ask people about pets and lifestyle, is that people who own dogs are more active than people who own other kinds of pets, right? That could be my hypothesis. I'm making this up. Don't furrow your brows. I'm just totally making this up. Okay. So that could be my hypothesis. Well, then I need to define codes that are going to help me decide if that hypothesis is right, okay, or sensible at least. Yeah.
As a researcher, would you be allowed to code like nonverbal data? Like,
So,
for instance, in my interviews, I've noticed that people are uncomfortable about certain topics, whatever. So I've noted like, okay, well, that's not really something you're giving me as data, but at the same time, I can tell that you're uncomfortable about it.
have you had a workshop on transcription already?
No.
Oh, that's stupid. Okay. So, okay, that's a whole different thing. It's a little bit outside the bailiwick of this, but you guys should prompt David to ask me to send you some stuff about transcription, because what we code are transcripts usually, right? And I mean, you could code the audio file directly if it's easy enough, but for most of the time it's not. Most of the time you need to read and reread and look at things multiple times, okay? So one of the ways that you can transcribe interviews, even if you just audio record them, there are approaches to transcribing how long people pause, right? And their pitch and other prosodic aspects of speech. In fact, folks here at UCLA in the anthropology department are pretty much the folks in the 70s who defined the transcript conventions for capturing all those aspects of speech that indicate not just the conceptual content of the words that people are saying, but like affective elements of talk, right? So when my pitch goes up, I'm excited. When my pitch goes down, I'm a little, right? And so there's there's very specific little symbols that people put into transcripts to show that that's what's happening. And so that's how you do that, right? And because then you have evidence in your transcript itself of things like discomfort, right? Or confusion, right? What do we sound like when we're confused? Yeah, or we say, well, I think it's like this. So when you're we interrupt ourselves really quickly. We stop and restart. There are ways to just show that in a transcript so you can see that that's what's happening. And because it is the case that for lots of analytic purposes, you want to have that stuff, right? That it does matter. You know, it especially comes up if your interviews are covering sensitive topics. Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's see what we can get done while we're waiting. Okay. All right. So sorry, it's my own fault that I'm not ready because okay, here's what we'll do. Let's start with open coding, okay? Because I think it'll be easier. Do you guys have some way to share documents with them? Karina?
I think David has an email, but I don't have that listed.
All right. And we only have the one screen. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we can do that. We'll do this collectively. I feel confident we can do this. Okay, so this is sort of one version of how you do open coding. I like this table because it's pretty straightforward, right? And so let's think about what we're doing, and then we'll come back. When Dave comes back, we'll practice top-down coding so you can get a sense of what that feels like to do. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to collectively practice some open coding. All right? So the first thing you have to do is you got to familiarize yourself with your data. Okay? Transcribing it if you need to. In my experience, you need to. And the reason is because, especially in open coding, there are things that can happen that will make you want to go back to things you think you've already coded. And so you want to have an easy way to do that. Okay? You generate an initial set of code. So what does that mean? What it means is you read your transcript and you see something that seems important. Okay? And you highlight it. And then you try to think of a word that describes why you like what that's about, or maybe two words, really short little labels. Okay? Oh, this is about money, or this is about family, right? And you just highlight it and you give it a label. Okay? And then, so every time you see something that feels new, you give it a new label. Every time you see something that feels the same, you give it one of the labels that you already have. Okay? And you go through, say, a whole transcript, like that. All right? And so you'll end up with a set of codes. Okay? And then, now, from there's a bunch of ways that you can do this. Okay? You can look at the code you have, even just from this one transcript, and you can ask yourself, are these all really different, actually? Or are some of them kind of the same? And if some of them are kind of the same, then you should think about squishing them together into one code. Okay? A general rule of thumb is to have, and this is going to make you mad, you should have all the codes you need, but not anymore. Okay? So you want to generate enough codes that you are really covering the things that people are saying to you, but you don't want to have a ton of code. It's unwieldy. Okay, it's really hard to work with. I did a project with a graduate student many years ago, and she was coding people's answers, sort of explanations for reasons they gave for. We asked them to rate some things, and then asked them why they gave their rating. And so she went through this. And she generated for like just one, there were like 100-odd kids. So she ended up on her first pass, she generated like almost a separate code for every single kid. Right? And I was like, no, wait a minute. That's not good, because what we're trying to do is reduce the data. Right? We're trying to look at how things are the same when they are. So you want to pay attention to what things are really different and what things are the same. Okay? And it sounds a little wishy-washy because it is a little wishy-washy, right? It's specific to your particular study, right? It's specific to the language that people say, okay? But anyway, so you take a crack at it, and then but when you start to have a set of initial codes, then you try to apply them across all of your transcripts, right? Okay? Now, here's the rub. Let's say, okay, so I interviewed 6 people. I've gone through 3 transcripts, right? And I've generated, I don't know, a dozen codes for different things. And then I'm reading transcript 4, and in the middle, that person says something that I haven't heard before. So now it needs a new code, right? Okay, now I got to go back to the first 3 transcripts, and I got to read all of them again to make sure that this code wasn't in there and I just didn't see it. Okay? All right? Because you've got to be systematic about how you apply codes. All right? And this can happen all the time because you start reading and you generate, when you read a transcript, you're just going to be having ideas about what you're seeing. And so you're going to start to make some codes. And you're going to miss, things will stand out as important. And then later, as the more you read though, you're just going to start to tune into different things, potentially at least. Right? And so if you come up with a new code, in the middle of some other transcript, you're going to want to go back and look at the things you've already coded to see if maybe it was there already. Okay? Yeah?
So even if they're using different vocabulary, different terms themselves, so even if they're using different vocabulary and different terms themselves, if we see the gist is a similar theme, it's okay to put it under that code?
Yeah, so sure, right? So look, let me think about Tyler's study, right? So it could be that he asked someone, well, so why did you choose to enroll in this college? And that person says, well, it was the only one my family could afford, And then he asked someone else, and that person says, because I don't have no money. Well, those are different words, but they're about the same thing, right? They're both about money, right? So so you want to focus on kind of the ideas in the words, right? Okay? Now, the question's really a good question because when you define codes, you've got to define them in terms of the language that makes them up, right? Or the ideas that they express, right? But one or both of those things, right? So, if Tyler was saying, oh, here's my one code is about money. I coded money when people talked about whether they could afford college or whether they had or didn't have money or talked about loans. Like this is the language that I heard that led to that code, right? So when you report this stuff, that's your responsibility is to talk about how you came up with it, all right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So say you have you're asking them why they chose a specific college.
Yeah.
And you have an answer that's between 2 codes. What would be the rule of thumb for that? So say, for example, the student says, I chose this college because my dad lost his job and we are not financially stable, and that has affected my mental health.
Okay.
Or, it's in between 2 codes.
Yeah. So what you do with that depends on, in a lot of ways, it depends on what you sort of what you want to do with the codes, but also sort of what you think the codes represent in your data, right? So it's very typical for, well, you have there are 2 approaches, right, that are both common. One is to say, well, okay, this is the answer. This part of the answer is this code, and this other part of the answer is this code. So it's literally different parts of the text are different codes, right? Because they're talking about different things. That's probably the most common way that people handle that kind of thing. But it could be that, let's see if I can show you. Well, okay, never mind. It could be that the way people talk, it's very difficult to disentangle the text. And you would just say, well, what they're saying is about this and this. And that's generally totally fine, right? What you do when you report that stuff is you just say whether or not your codes are, whether responses could be multiply coded or not, right? So one thing that you guys should understand about research is there aren't really rules so much as there are standards and expectations, right? And so in social science research in general and education research in particular, people expect that you can explain why you did things the way that you did And then they decide whether they buy that explanation as a reasonable one or not, right? So it's hard to say that there are hard and fast rules. Now, okay, so let's practice. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, okay? So you guys got a sheet of paper that I think is just a table. It has 2 columns. The first column names who's talking. It's either the interviewer or the participant. And then the second column is what they said. So this comes from a study that I've been doing for the last few years. And one of the things that, around helping middle and high school teachers teach to our new next generation science standards. And so one of the things that we did a few years ago, right at the very beginning, is we had teachers try to do something new in their classroom. And then we asked them about it. Because we wanted to know what they thought was challenging and what they thought were sort of new opportunities, okay? So we came up with a very kind of loosely structured protocol that was of about 6 to 8 questions, right? It's semi-structured. You guys, does that make sense to you guys? Have you heard that before? Okay, so someone tell me what a semi-structured interview is. See, every class is people who really want to answer questions. How about someone who hasn't spoken yet?
A semi-structured interview is like you prepare questions beforehand, but you could also have follow-ups and you have like a little bit of leeway.
All right, exactly. A little or a lot, actually. Sometimes you can have a lot. It really depends on what your participants say. Okay, thank you. So that's good. All right, so that's what this was. And we decided that we would do open coding because there hasn't actually been a lot of work on this topic. There's a lot of work on how teachers think about change. And so we had a sense that they would say like, oh, it takes too much time, or oh, it's really, you know, or you know, I don't have support from my administrators or whatever. But we didn't really have a very good sense of how they would talk about those challenges in relation specifically to the stuff that we were doing. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. So does everyone have the transcript? Okay, so it's really simple. I want you to, this is a short portion of this transcript, right? It's just front and back, a couple of pages. Some of you have single-sided, some of you have double-sided. So take a few minutes to just read through it. Get a sense of what it's about, okay? Then go back to the top, and anything that a teacher says that sort of stands out to you as interesting, just underline it, or circle it, or do something. Mark that chunk of text, and then try to give it a label for what it's about. And then just go through and do that with those 2 pages, okay? So, but what I'm curious about is, what was challenging for you about that? And what was easy? So let's start here.
So I guess the challenge for me was figuring out the context and trying to, you know, develop a set of codes or find some kind of pattern, you know, not really knowing, you know, what the entirety of the study was.
What the heck it's about.
Right.
Right? Okay, so that's a specific challenge to this exercise that you won't have in your own words, right? Hopefully, because you know what the context is, right? But there is a challenge of like orienting yourself to what it is that people are talking are saying, right? Okay, then let's come down here.
I was going to ask this earlier and I would have made this easier, but is it theme and then code, or is it codes and then theme?
Codes become themes. The way I think of it is this: codes are like low-level things that are really about the data, right? You know what? Okay, hold on. Take it back. It can really depend. All right. So this gentleman here, what's your name?
Anthony.
So Anthony described to me that what he did was he read and he sort of noticed, oh, these are challenges, right? And so he just wrote the word challenges and he underlined anything that was a challenge, right? That, to my way of thinking, is a little bit high level, right? Because the lower level would be, okay, but what are the specific challenges, right? Okay? And the specific challenges I would tend to think of as codes, right? Whereas challenges itself is kind of a theme. So this is why I say like that, I can give you a list of steps, right? It's a heuristic, right? It's a rule of thumb because it's not it just really depends. People have different ways of doing it. What matters is, like, it doesn't actually really matter if you start with themes and then go to codes, or codes and then go to themes. All that matters is you work systematically through the data, and you just try to be as systematic and as careful as you can be, right? And there are lots of different ways to achieve that. Okay, let's see, someone else had their hand up. I can't remember. Okay, Tyler.
There's one in the back too, right?
Oh, okay, sorry.
Did you have the mic or? Okay. Challenging, like the time constraint, obviously. But I think what was easy is like the collaboration. When Donnell and I were able to compare, you know, I was seeing certain themes and coming with my approach, and he was using or seeing other themes and going with his approach, kind of code to theme, and I was going theme to code. So.
Okay, so were you underlying different pieces of text?
Yeah.
Okay, so how many people found that they were underlying different pieces of text than the people that they talked to? Okay, look around the room. Okay? So, almost everybody, right? This is inevitable. Even if you had more background, right, you would still underline different things, okay? Because you're going to come to whatever it is with your own set of experiences, so it's going to tune your eyes into different things than someone else is tuned into, okay? And so that's an issue that we'll come back to, all right? But you're saying that collaboration was actually a kind of a productive thing because you, what?
I was able to see things that I didn't previously see.
So you see things that someone else sees, you get a chance to explain what your thinking is behind this label or whatever. Okay, so it's a way of kind of clarifying your thinking back. All right, then there was someone back here.
Yeah, so my question is just, for me it wasn't so difficult actually like analyzing what was being said, but for me it's like, what are these codes supposed to look like? Like, are they just like pull out like summaries of it? Or, because like I had a lot of information, but I don't know if that like counts as a code or if they like, I don't know, I'm just a little confused about that.
So codes can look a lot of different ways, all right? So when the grad student who conducted this interview went back and started analyzing it, what she did was she just used different highlight colors in Microsoft Word, okay? To mean different things. And she actually started at a pretty high level. One of her sort of thematic ideas was challenges, right? So much like Anthony. So anytime she saw someone talking about, oh, this was kind of hard, or I didn't know how to do this, or whatever, she would just, I think that was red, okay? And that was like a challenge. And then green was something like goals, like things they wanted to do in the future, right? So anytime they said something like, well, I think next time I might do it like this or whatever, it said, okay, that was green. And yellow was something else, and then I think there was a different shade of green was something else, okay? And that's a first pass, all right? And then what you do from there is you collect somehow, whatever seems, in whatever way that seems easier, you collect, say, all the things that you highlighted red, okay? And then you say, okay, what are these really about? Are they all about the same thing, right? In this case, they're not about the same thing, right? Because I don't know about this teacher here in this couple of pages, but together, the teachers have a bunch of very specific challenges to what we were asking them to do. And that's what we want to know, right? So like think about you know, if you're writing out this study. Oh, we talked to 25 teachers about what it's like to teach the new standards, and 22 of them said they had challenges. And then we left it at that, right? Nobody cares. Like, you haven't learned anything, right? So instead, if you could say, like, the most common challenge that teachers told us about was they didn't know how to get their students to talk to each other, right? Okay, that's something you can do something with, right? So now, which of those is a code and which of those is a theme? I would say challenges is kind of more thematic, and get students talking is more like a code, okay? But again, sometimes they fall, so to go back, I'm sorry, what's your question? What's your name?
Kimberly.
Kimberly?
Kimberly.
Okay, so that's why, you know, I had to back off my initial answer to Kimberly, because in fact, you often get a loose sort of sense of like, okay, these things are about different things, but then you have to dig into it to figure out exactly why and how things that say are about challenges are about different challenges, right? And again, for us, that's what we're interested in the texture of the challenges that they have, right? So that's what we're looking for. You guys are obviously you're looking for different things, okay? All right, let's take maybe one more thing that was challenging or not challenging. Yeah.
I had mentioned it to you earlier.
Yeah.
I had already said it to you earlier, but my struggle was just more of like, I don't know what specifically I'm looking for because I didn't know what the research was.
Yeah.
Nor did I have any background info on it. It was just kind of like, hey guys, let's look the codes in this one.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh god, I don't know if this is important or not. So I was like.
Well, I set you up a little bit,
Yeah.
right, for pedagogical purposes, right? Because in not giving you a lot of background, I felt pretty confident that you would notice different things from each other, which is what I wanted, right? So, but if I was like paying you to analyze these interviews, I'd give you a lot more background about the kinds of things we were looking for, right? And so again, I think that's an issue that is specific to this being an exercise, okay? But you will find, I feel fairly sure, you will find when you look at your own transcripts that you're not quite sure. Okay, it will happen to you probably. Okay, yeah, Tyler.
What are some of the challenges that you deal with at the PhD level?
Well, I mean, the kinds of challenges are the same, right? What's different about it as like a doctoral student is it's often the case that you're not. Well, it's always the case that you're not doing this alone, right? So in this particular interview study, so this was we were working with 25 teachers. We had, I think, 4 of us do interviews, right? And then 2 of us were primarily responsible for coding. But what they had to do, so they had to sit together, and so they each looked at, I think, 2 or 3 transcripts independently, different transcripts, came up with what they thought were codes, and then kind of swapped them, talked about what they were seeing, and then tried to do each other, the 3, then they swapped transcripts, right? And then tried to code that, and then you find, okay, where are we confused, where we disagree, how are we seeing this differently? And they try to come to some agreement among the 2 of them. And then they had to come back to the larger project team and persuade us that they had something going. And so we would say, well, I don't know, wait a minute, I don't know what this, how's this about that? Or, so there's like this, and then they basically had to do that over and over and over again until I was happy, right? That's the guy running the show. Like, they had to basically make me happy. So once the 5 of us or so who were actually involved in the research team agreed, okay, this is a good set of codes, right? Then the process stopped. It took us, I'd say probably, it took us a few months to get there.
So it's a lot of logistical concerns then?
Well, it's a lot of repeated work. You just, you have to look, you end up looking at the same transcript over and over and over and over again to satisfy yourself that you are seeing what you think you're seeing, right? And then there are the logistics of just getting, I mean, it didn't have to take 2.5 months, except we only had our research meetings every other week, so that's like that's built into the schedule. But on the other hand, that's because in the 2 weeks in between, those 2 graduate researchers in particular were doing a ton of work, right? A ton of work on interviews. Yeah, I think there's a question back
there. Okay, I was just going to speak to that question a little bit that he had. I have a master's, but I'm preparing to apply for PhD, and I'm out in the world now and have been on several research projects in grad school as well. What is the benefit is that when you go into these projects, your prior knowledge kind of pulls everything out so fast for you, and you go back to your research team, and each one is contributing this body of knowledge and these themes and codes that came so easy to them, and then it's very collaborative in a sense. So when I looked at this interview, based on what I've done in the past, everything that popped out at me had to do with teacher effectiveness, best practices, collaboration, everything that I've constantly been looking for in my work. So, and I think that's what makes it easy, so to speak.
Well, it certainly, yeah, so I would agree with that. So there are two things that I would emphasize about that. One is, nobody who looks at an interview and then tries to sort of figure out what is getting said does that without their own experience, right? That's all we have when we do this, right? And so, of course, two people are going to see different things because they have different experiences. Right? And so what you're trying to do is get those multiple people together to converge on a common set of things, right? Now, it is often the case that as a researcher, you might on your own, just like you're doing now, say, well, I'm going to do an interview study, I'm going to interview these people, I'm going to figure out what they're telling me, okay? There are still processes where, in professional research, where you would have to run all that stuff past somebody, or some set of somebodies, right? You have to persuade people that it makes sense. And there are, in fact, just to put a button on the open coding approach here. So what is it that makes open coding trustworthy? Like, it's just me, I'm just reading this stuff, and I decide what they're telling me, and I get to come up with the labels. And how's anybody who's not looking at the transcripts like I am supposed to trust that my codes really represent the data, right? So what can I do to make this stuff trustworthy? So one is, again, we mentioned this recursive analysis, right? That when you create new codes through the web, you've got to recurse, you've got to go back to the other stuff, okay? You should write some sort of a manual. Some people call it code manuals or a code book, but you should write some sort of document that just says, here's my code, here's what it means, right? Here's this code, here's what it means. It's ideal if you can also say, here are the kinds of things, here are the kinds of words that underlie that definition, right? So here are the kinds of things that people say, okay? Then, try to find somebody else. I don't know if this is practical for you guys right now, but if you do this as doctoral students, you would almost certainly be required to do this. You find someone else, you find a friend of yours who doesn't know anything at all about your study, and you give them your code book, and you kind of talk through the code book with them, and then you give them some of your transcripts, and you say, please code this for me, okay? Because you want to find out if they come up with the same thing that you do, right? Because if they don't, then it means you haven't defined your codes very clearly, and that's a problem, right? Okay? Because one of the ways, and this is sort of related to what she was saying back there, is that that's one of the sort of ways that we collaborate in this stuff is by trying to explain like as the individual coder, if I can explain my thinking clearly enough that you can use that thinking and apply it to the data and come up with mostly the same results, okay, that's good. That means I'm being clear, okay? It's a sort of a version of replicability, right, for this kind of work, right? And then what you want to do is you want to figure out how much you agree, okay? And we can talk a little bit about that at the end.
I have a question. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, so my question is on the actual coding or interpretation. So I don't know if you have the paper, but on the second page, the second response of the participant starts with, I think one, it starts with, okay, sorry. It starts with the teacher talking about how they think one lesson went a lot better than the other. So from this entire like response, I got two different codings. So one of them was that there was a lot of variability in learning because students learn like in different rates and stuff like that. But then I also got that it was positive because I'm gonna assume so she gets to tweak the lessons each time, so she makes it a lot better. So the variability, I interpreted that as a challenge, and the tweaking lessons is something that is kind of positive. So she says that in general, she thinks that it was good. So with me making the assumption that the variability is a challenge, is that just putting words in her mouth? Or like, how do I know that she actually like meant that, or, yeah.
So you're talking about this here, right?
Yeah, like that entire, I know it's kind of long.
Well, where is she talking about variability? I was just trying to...
Because she says that one went a lot better than the other, and she talks about how she teaches 6 of the same classes, and like how you always kind of teach something different, you tweak it, so there's variability, not each class is getting the exact same lesson.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this is an example of the kind of thing you're talking about. So I could buy your interpretation, right? But I might have a different interpretation, and then we would essentially argue about whose interpretation is better, and we pick one, and then we would go with that from that point forward, right? So that's part of how we would define what the right interpretation. So we would say, okay, so fine, this is about variability. So this is sort of what I'm talking about. You have to kind of persuade somebody else that this thing that's being said is really about variability as a challenge, and then that might be your label. And then if we agree that that's our code, then we are going to go look for that code from that point forward, right? And if we're in the middle of our analysis, we'd also say, did anybody else talk about variability and we just missed it? And we'd go back and we look for it, right? Let's do real quick a top-down example. And although, do me a favor if you don't mind, because these are like, these are real data, and I'll get in a lot of trouble if it just disperses through the universe. So just, if you don't mind, just take the transcript sheets and just send them to the end of the row so that I can get rid of them. So this is a little research meta point. When you guys do research, right, especially if it's funded by somebody, especially by the federal government, like you're legally responsible to protect your data, okay? Because you're legally responsible to protect your participants, okay? You've got to protect their confidentiality when they agree to work with you. So you can't just kind of not take care of the data. You got to really know where it is and have a good hold on it. Okay, let's do another quick example. How you guys holding up? Okay. All right, so let's. Hey. Okay, so let's do the top down one. Okay, so I do science education research, so all this stuff I do is about science. So if you're not interested in science, I apologize. So this study was I wanted to know what high school students thought about the nature of scientific theories and the relationships between theories and experiments. Okay. Now, this was something that people had studied a fair amount, and so I interviewed some high school kids with somebody else's interview protocol. Okay, so some other group of researchers had come up with this interview, all right, and they had used it a few times, and I thought, well, okay, I'll use it with these kids I'm working with, and I'll see what kinds of things I get. Okay. So this interview was a semi-structured interview, about 20, like I think 22 questions, okay? And it came with a code book that was specified, okay? And what they had done was they had developed codes for clusters of questions. So they asked a few questions that were kind of related to each other, and then they just coded those as a set. All right? So some of the codes were things like, what do you think science is all about? And someone says, oh, it's about making the world better for humanity. And you say, so what do you think the goals, and what do you think scientists' goals are? And they, oh, they're, you know, they want to like figure things out. And then I think there's one other question about that was kind of related to goals, and you code those questions as a unit, okay? But separate from other questions, because from their perspective, other questions were about things that were totally different, okay? So again, that may be what your interview's like, it may not be what your interview's like, but now we're, but that's what this was about, okay? And so the codes are, or in this case, these codes are organized into levels because the people who developed the interview were really interested in the question of sophistication, right? So they had ideas about what was a naive way of thinking about theories and experiments and how they relate to each other, and what was a more sophisticated way of thinking about it. So their codes were designed to see where students fell, okay? All right? So we're going to ignore that, all right, for now. And now, it turned out that when they sent me their code book, about half the questions didn't have any codes. And I was like, wow, hello, what did you do with these questions? And they said, oh, well, you know, we were talking to sixth graders and we couldn't make heads or tails of how they answered these questions, so we just ignored them. I was like, oh God, this is terrible. So now I have to come up with codes, right? So that's what we did. And we actually came up with codes in an inductive way, okay? But we came up with codes. And so they just have the transcript, right?
Yeah, it's at the, everyone on the right, the farthest right has the transcripts. Can you pass it down to the left, please? Take one and pass it down.
And we don't have any paper copies of the coding scheme?
Yeah, you would need to pull it up.
Okay, all right, that's okay. All right. So, we're going to do an abbreviated version of this because otherwise it'll be too hard. Okay, so let me not do that. That's terrible. Okay, so I want you to go on the transcript, go to where the line that says Q9. Okay? We're going to start with Q9. All right? Full disclosure, B stands for Bill. Okay? And S whatever is just the like ID we gave to students, so nobody would know who they were. Okay? All right. So I'm going to try to walk you through this code book. So question number 9 asks kids, how does a scientist decide what experiment to do? Okay? And these are our codes. Okay? Forget about the level, it doesn't matter. One is, kids say something vague, that there's some vague, unspecified relationship between what scientists are interested in and the experiment they choose to perform. But they definitely don't mention that they're trying to answer questions or test ideas. Right? Okay? And if they say that, it's code number 1. Okay? It's just like, they have a way of picking, but I don't know. Right? Yeah?
I have a quick question. Can you zoom in on the document?
Oh, more? Okay, sorry. Yeah. How big I can make it. Whoa. That's too big. How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so that's number 1. Okay? Number 2 is scientists do an experiment to find an answer or to solve a problem. Like, those are the words that they use. Okay? Number 3 is they say, well, they do experiments because that's the best, they choose the best experiment available to help them answer. Okay? The difference is two things. One is that they have a question in mind, so the kid says something that they start with a question, and that motivates the experiment. Okay, and we distinguish between whether kids say they do an experiment to find, so it's different to say they do an experiment to answer the question. That's different than they do an experiment to help answer the question. Okay? The reason it's different is because answer straight up, like I can do one experiment and answer my question and I'm done. That's a different idea than, oh, I might have to do more than one experiment. Right? The one experiment only helps to answer the question. So we want to keep those things different. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. And then the fourth one is they say something like, well, they have an idea, they want to test the idea, so they do an experiment to test the idea. So they talk, rather than talk about getting answers in a vague way, they say they have an idea already that's an answer, and then they don't want to test that answer. Okay? So let's start with those four. Now let's try to, so what I want you to do is read the answers to question 9. So read everything between Q9 and Q10. Okay? And give it one of these 4 codes. So vague relationship, that's number 1. Unspecified relationship is number 1. Find an answer or solve the problem is number 2. Number 3 is getting evidence for a question. So they talk about having a question first. Okay? And then number 4 is they talk about having ideas first. Talk about testing an idea. All right? Okay. How many people gave it a 1? Just raise your hand if you gave it a 1. Raise it up nice and high. And everybody else turn around and look at who did it. Okay. So how many people gave it a 2? 1? Okay. Don't be shy though. Raise your hands high. Okay. All right. How many people gave it a 3? Okay. 2? Okay. How many people gave it a 4? Okay. All right. Talk to the person next to you and justify why you gave it the answer that you gave it.
So what would you argue?
It's hard.
You would just make up like an experiment and like, so I think it's more just saying like.
So we're almost done. We'll just wrap up. Okay. So, all right. So, what's challenging about doing that? About doing this? What we just did.
You make arguments for which code it is.
You gotta make arguments for which code, right? And
You can make arguments for which code it is.
so that's one thing that's hard. What's another thing that's hard? Yeah, Kimberly.
The language that they use, it's vocabulary that's kind of difficult to understand because there's a lot of pauses and the language that they use because they are younger demographic, so they use a lot of pauses and fillers. So it's about thinking through those fillers and seeing what they're really saying.
So they do use a lot of pauses and fillers, although I would argue it's not because they're young, it's just because they don't know how to answer the question. But that actually, right, and so, but that is part of it. Yeah, back there.
I think that's hard because you specified that there is only one question and you have to read the whole.
Or the question to just even make a sense of.
So this is a very particular way of analyzing interviews, right? This kind of question by question, and it is very, it raises a lot of interesting technical challenges because it can be really hard to understand what someone means, right? It's also a very particular view on how interviews work that doesn't treat the thing as a conversation, right? So the thing about interviews is they're actually conversations. So there's a conversational history between me and this poor kid, whoever it was. And by the time we get to question 9, and so people have argued that you can't pretend that there's no history there. When you're trying to understand how they're thinking about question 9, you can't just pretend they haven't answered 8 questions already. So that's a thing that's particular to this style. This is a style of analysis that's very typical of certain, of sort of cognitive psychology, less typical of their social science fields. Okay, and then someone else, I want to just take one more minute.
I guess for me it was challenging just because the interviewer followed up with questions that might lead the student to answer, give you more context on the codes itself. So trying to understand when the right time to stop reading is, because the student can like follow up with answers that fit this description, but not necessarily answer it from the beginning.
Yeah. So why is the interviewer following up, do you think?
So like, I guess what I was assuming that you were following up with is you want to code it into like your scientific language. So you want to figure out if the student is thinking about a hypothesis or not. Granted, it's kind of challenging as a reader because I'm like trying to assume when the student says, yeah, I've heard of a hypothesis, does that mean, yeah, I know what it is, or does that mean like, yeah, I've heard someone use the word before?
Well, that's actually the next question. I don't know why. There's a Q10 that's supposed to go above that. Because hypothesis was next. Because the next question is, okay, so what's the hypothesis?
So you're transitioning.
Yeah. So I don't know. These are 20 years old, and somehow 20 years ago I mislabeled that. So let me take one because you have your hand up for us. Let me just take one more.
Challenge for me was taking the words that the student used and categorizing it between like 3 or 4. Like, what does it mean to test ideas? What does it mean to get an answer? So just kind of like figuring out, like picking apart the student's words to put it in a certain category.
Right. That's the difficulty. That's the main difficulty of a priori coding, right? That if your codes aren't kind of well matched to the language that your participants actually use, it's pretty darn hard to apply the codes, right? And so that's the work that you have to do in that kind of setup, right? If that's what you choose to do, okay? Is you've got to really think about what language am I going to need to hear to make this a code. Like I would code this person as a number 1 because I don't even know what they're saying. I can't understand what they're saying, right? And actually, now looking back, I think, okay, that's fine, that's a good answer. So like, that's me being like, I can't torture this kid anymore. Like obviously there's been some trouble up to that point, and I'm just letting them off the hook, right? So, because mostly what I did was, if they said something I didn't understand, I would ask them I would just say, so are you saying this? And they would say, sometimes they'd say yes, sometimes they'd say, no, I'm saying that, and then, right? So anyway, okay, so let's wrap up. You guys have been really patient, I appreciate it. And so the, so, come on now, come on. So let's just conclude. Oh, a couple things. Okay. I'm gonna skip talking about like rate of reliability and agreement because I have a strong feeling none of you will do it, just because of the scope of your problems, projects. Okay. Well, I'll tell 2 things. There's 2 ways you can do it. One is you can just figure out how much the 2 coders agreed less how much they didn't agree, divided by the number of things that they coded. That gives you a percentage, and the percentage, the higher the better. Okay? If it's lower than about 60%, then that means that's like flipping a coin, right? So that's not very good. Okay? But if it's better than about 80%, okay, that's pretty good. There's also a statistic, this thing called Cohen's kappa. And what you do is you basically dump into a statistics program coder 1, coder 2, and then it figures out a probability that you're agreeing by chance based on how many codes there are, right? So there's 4 codes there, right? So it actually makes it more, in ways that I don't quite understand mathematically, it increases the probability that we'll agree by chance rather than reducing it. And so the more codes you have, the higher kappa value you need to be considered a good reliability, okay? Most people, well, there are some fields in which interview studies get published that nobody does this ever and nobody seems to care. In a lot of psychology related fields, they do care about this stuff. And for the people who do care, they tend to take reliability as a more credible statistic than just percentage. Because it factors in again, it just factors in how likely it is you'd agree by chance, okay? But the main thing I want to leave you with are a few final thoughts. One is that, again, your codes are not data. We treat them as data, but they're not data. They're your way of representing the data, right? Okay? And they're helpful because they allow us to do certain kinds of things. And if you read interview studies, what you'll see is we might report codes, but we almost always show you the language that people actually use so you can make sense of those codes, right? It's very rare to read an interview study that doesn't have excerpts of what people actually said. The other thing is, it's really important that you, and this goes back to this question about what makes codes different from hypotheses. Your codes really should represent what you hear people say, not what you hoped they would say, right? This is a mistake that people make often, is they define codes in terms of what they expect people are going to tell them, rather than what people do tell them. And so you've got to keep your ear tuned to whether there's a good match there, okay? When you write this stuff up as a report, if you do, it's very important to explain, as part of your sort of description of methods, it's important to explain how you figured out your codes, right? Or else readers will have no way to figure out if they make any sense, right? And the best way to do it is to sort of talk about what sorts of words got counted as one code and what other words got counted as a different code, right? That's the best way to kind of do that. And then finally, if you're probably, given how far along you are, you're probably well aware of this already, but take your time. Take your time to do it well. I know that the interviews themselves that you're doing, they take time. Transcribing interviews takes time. But take your time to really think about, if you decide to code your interviews, right? Coding can really tell you a lot because it really makes you focus on, like, okay, what are the kind of thematic ideas that are in here? But take your time. And don't be afraid of the fact that you'll have to read your transcripts many, many times before you kind of settle on what you think are a good set of codes. All right? I don't know, do we have time for any final questions, Denny?
Yeah, I think asking questions would be good instead of, because they're going to like swarm you in a line and try to ask you individual questions. So,
okay.
Open formats.
All right, so let the swarm begin.
Was the color coding the best coding system that you have seen, or what is the best coding system that you've seen a student use and it was most efficient?
Oh, that's a good question. So the thing is, so when I did this study years and years and years ago, I literally cut transcripts into little strips of paper. And then I put, because I knew I have to code questions 1 through 3 together. Okay, I'm going to have all, right? And I just put them all in a pile. Okay? And then I went through and I sorted them out, all right, according to the codes. And then, but now we don't do that on paper anymore because we have software programs to do this for you, right? So what my students do, so the researcher who was doing that interview, she liked to just go through and highlight and color code. I've seen people do that. Is that efficient? I don't know if that's efficient. It's efficient in one sense because you can see very easily what bits of text you think count as particular kinds of things. But it's not that efficient because then you got to have the definition of, like, okay, what's green again? I mean, that's got to be somewhere else. It's not easily visible, right? So most of us who do this stuff like professionally, we get one of about 5 or 6 different software programs because then we can actually work on a document, and when we highlight a piece of text and we say this is finding answers, then it says, okay, got it. And then the next time you highlight a piece of text, you just go, you have a list of all your codes and you go, this is finding answers, right? And then you can do all kinds of things, right? And you can say, like, hey, show me all the finding answers that I have. And the thing will just pull out those bits of text. So most of us now do this stuff with software. Unfortunately, that software is hideously expensive. Like hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Yeah, really, really expensive. It's hard to do it. It's hard to make it. So.
Thank you.
But if you have paper and scissors, I like paper and scissors a lot. Yeah.
So the interview that you guys conducted on the teachers, is that currently ongoing?
With the teachers.
Oh, with the teachers. Is that currently ongoing, or is that already been published?
That, well, let's see, the article of those interviews is under review at the moment, so we're waiting to find out what we have to fix about it, right? And then the actual work itself was finished in June.
Okay, and then my follow-up question to that is, so you guys talk about teachers in middle school and high school. Is it with a specific district or public schools, private schools?
These were public school teachers in a metro LA school district.
Okay, thank you.
So notice what I did there. Right? I have to. You really must. You have to protect people's confidentiality. Yeah. Okay. Let's see over here. Oh, wait, sorry. Someone has
I have my.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
I can't see you guys.
Oh, that's okay. I'm thinking back to the beginning of your talk about when you're developing the themes,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, do you ever find yourself having to create sub-themes, or is that not a practice you do? Is there, for instance, cost of education, and then from under there, the different things that might fall? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm a very, my own process is pretty mixed up, right? Like sometimes I'll see something and I'll have a very specific idea about what that's about, and I'll try to name it that specific idea. And other times I'll have just a very general idea and I'll just label it that general idea. And then if I find myself applying a general idea, say like cost of college or something, when I get, so the way I tend to develop codes is I pick say 10% of the transcripts, and I just say I'm going to go through all of these transcripts and see how many codes I end up with, okay, to begin with. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to take a subset to develop some codes from, okay? And then, so when I've done that, and so depending on the sample, that could be 3 transcripts or it could be 5 or whatever, right? And I don't think I would do it with less than 3 actually, because I just know I'm going to run into a lot of variability. So let's just pick 3, right? So I'd go through 3 and I'd end up with a set of codes. And at that point I would say, okay, these are all the little things that I've said are about cost of college. Are they really about that? So that's the first thing I would do. Are they really about that? And then if I found some that I decide, no, they're not about that, so I'd kick them out of that pile, right? And then I'd say, okay, so now they're all about cost of college. Do they differ from each other in some meaningful way? And then if they do, that's when I would create the sort of sub-distinctions there, right? But I might, if I knew I was tuned to, say, cost from the get-go, I might already be thinking in terms of distinguishing those things, right? So I might already have in my mind, oh, this guy's talking about his own money, or this person's talking about her family's money. And so I might tag those at that level from the jump. It really just depends. It's really variable. And this is why I say you got to take the time to do it well, because my view of doing research is I'm trying to prove that I'm wrong most of the time, okay? And if I go through all this work and I can really satisfy myself that these codes aren't stupid, right, that they really do characterize my data, and it's the kind of smallest set that does, and I can persuade other people, then I feel like, okay, maybe I'm onto something, right? But I try really hard to show that I'm being biased, or that I'm just got a bad idea or whatever. I try really hard, because I find that if I apply that metric to myself, I tend to do a better job, right?
On that point that you're talking about, are you intentional on the demographics you're interviewing?
Well, sure, right? Because I mean, ideally every research study is intentional about its sample of participants, right? And so you do different things for different kinds of work, right? So the teacher interview, for example, okay, interview is just one thing we did with these teachers, right? So the real question is, why did we work with these teachers, right? We worked with these, so just as an example. So we worked with these teachers because they work in a very urban district, right? And they work with a population of students that many parts of the country don't think can learn science, right? So we don't believe that. So we wanted to kind of engage in that work, and we wanted to understand those teachers because of the students that they work with. That was kind of the driving motive behind that thing, right? So, but I am hiding something from you a little bit, which is that I've never, for me, interviewing is always part of some larger study. I've never just gone and done an interview study. That's just the projects have always been a little bit bigger than that, right? So I think you.
I did, but you indirectly answered it
Okay.
with her question.
Okay.
But I am curious what led to your interest in education.
Well, okay, so that's a good question. It's not a great answer. When I went to college, I studied computer science because I wanted to become a computer programmer. This was almost 40 years ago. And so like before PCs. Not that long before PCs, but before PCs. So I wanted to write computer software, and it just turned out one of the first jobs I had out of college was about making interactive video programs for business training, right? And I thought, God, what a cool technology and what a stupid thing to do, right? I mean, whatever. People should learn how to do their jobs well. But I was like, it didn't really appeal to me. But the technology was really cool. And at the time, I asked my boss, like, why don't we do this for schools? It seems like school would be a lot more fun if they could do things like this. And he just laughed and laughed and laughed, like laughed for probably 2 minutes. So, and then he said, schools don't have any money. Because it was really expensive at the time to do this, right? So I was like, okay, that's a bad answer. So then I went away and I did some other stuff for a while, but I kind of always had this idea that I wanted to build educational technology. And so I wound up at a place where I could do that, but in working with teachers in classrooms, I kind of quickly became interested in classroom life and sort of how that goes and how teachers and students interact with each other and how you could sort of disrupt that, to use a popular word these days, right? Disrupt that so that the kids aren't wasting their time. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but science teaching, overall, it's not very good. And so it's important to figure out how to help folks do it better. So that's basically what I've been doing. And I used to use software for that as part of that mission, but I don't do that anymore. I haven't done it for a long time. But that was the thing. I wasn't really like a jacked up activist for education when I was young. I was aware that there was inequality, but and that was eventually that was part of the reason that got me into it, right? But I wasn't. I actually became really passionate about doing research as I started doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah.